Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Glad to have you here for another quiet inquiry. Tell me, has ink ever failed you? A word faded before its meaning was fully kept. Tonight's tale turns upon a single vanished signature, and all the silence built to guard it. Watson believed no document, however carefully altered, could outlast a patient eye. Do subscribe, so no page goes unread. Now, settle in. For truth, once written, is not so easily erased. Find us always on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel, linked below. Chapter 1: The House of Fairbourne. It was in the bleak days of January, when the fog lay so thickly upon Baker Street that the lamplighters seemed to labour in vain against the gathering dusk, that I had occasion to witness one of the more curious cases in which my friend Sherlock Holmes was ever engaged. I had called upon him that afternoon, as had become my habit since my marriage, finding some comfort in the familiar disorder of his rooms after the quiet regularity of my own household. He was seated by the fire in his mouse-coloured dressing-gown, his long fingers steepled before him, when Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor. "Sir Edmund Fairbourne," she said, and I saw at once from the manner in which Holmes's eyes brightened that the name meant something to him, though it meant nothing at all to me. The gentleman who entered was perhaps 45, of upright bearing, dressed with the careful sobriety of a man from an old family that valued appearances above ostentation. Yet there was an anxiety about his mouth, and a restlessness in his gloved hands that spoke of trouble not easily borne. He glanced at me with some hesitation. "You may speak freely before Dr. Watson," said Holmes. "He has been my companion in every matter of importance for these many years, and his discretion is beyond question." Sir Edmund inclined his head and seated himself upon the edge of the chair Holmes indicated, as though he could not permit himself the comfort of leaning back. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "I come to you upon a matter that touches my family's honour so nearly that I scarcely know how to set it before a stranger. My elder brother, Lionel Fairbourne, died a fortnight ago at Fairbourne Hall in Surrey. He was the head of our family, and upon his shoulders rested not only the management of the estate, but the guardianship of certain trust documents of the greatest delicacy." "Pray continue," said Holmes, closing his eyes in that attitude of attention which those unfamiliar with him might mistake for indifference. Among these documents was one bearing the signature of a magistrate, confirming the legitimacy of a claim upon the estate by a young relative of ours, Henry Fairbourne. Without that signature, Henry's position becomes uncertain, and the estate may pass elsewhere. Mr. Holmes, the signature has vanished. Not the document remains whole and entire, but the signature itself has been most carefully erased, as though it had never been set down." Holmes opened his eyes at this. "Erased, you say, and not merely obscured or defaced?" "Erased, sir, with such skill that my own solicitor, upon first examination, believed the document had simply never been signed at all. It was only upon close inspection, under a strong glass, that the faintest trace of the ink's former presence could be discerned." "And when was this discovered?" "The morning after my brother's death. He had gone to his study after dinner, as was his custom, to review certain papers, and was found the next morning in his chair, quite dead. The physician attributes it to a seizure of the heart, brought on perhaps by some sudden shock. The room, I should say, was locked from within, and the key was in my brother's own pocket." I confess that at this recital a chill passed through me, and I glanced at Holmes to see how he received so singular a conjunction of circumstances. He had drawn himself forward in his chair, his thin face sharpened with that eager, hawk-like interest, which I had come to recognise as the surest sign that a problem had engaged the whole of his remarkable faculties. "You interest me exceedingly," said he. "Tell me of the household. Who resides at Fairbourne Hall?" "My brother's widow, Clara, a woman of great pride in the family name. A cousin, Arthur Vane, who has lived upon my brother's generosity these several years, and whose debts, I regret to say, are considerable. A governess, Miss Beatrice Harland, who has charge of the younger children, and Henry himself, the young man whose claim depends upon the very signature that has been destroyed. A household, then, in which several persons might have reason to wish that signature away, Holmes observed, and one person at the least who had every reason to preserve it. Precisely so, Mr. Holmes. That is why I have come to you, rather than to the local constabulary, though Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard has already been called in at my solicitor's insistence. I do not think the truth of this matter will be found by ordinary methods. There is something in that house, Mr. Holmes, some undercurrent I cannot name, that I believe wants a subtler instrument than the police to bring it to light. Holmes rose and stood for a moment before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back. Dr. Watson and I will come down to Fairbourne Hall tomorrow, if that is convenient. In the meanwhile, Sir Edmund, I must ask that nothing in the study be disturbed, and that no member of the household be told of our purpose beyond what is necessary. It shall be as you say. Sir Edmund rose, and I saw relief mingled with his anxiety, as of a man who has set down some part of a burden too heavy to carry alone. I am grateful to you, Mr. Holmes, more than I can express. When he had gone, Holmes remained standing by the mantel, filling his pipe with the shag tobacco he kept in the toe of a Persian slipper. "A pretty problem, Watson," said he at last. "A sealed room, a dead man, and a signature erased with a skill that speaks of knowledge, not mere malice. What do you make of it?" "I confess I am at a loss," said I. "It would seem that the natural suspect is this cousin, Arthur Vane, with his debts and his dependence upon the dead man's charity." Holmes smiled faintly through the blue smoke that had begun to curl about his head. "It would seem so, Watson. It would seem so indeed. And that, I think, is precisely why I distrust the appearance of the thing. In my experience, the truth that seems most obvious upon a first hearing has usually been arranged to seem so by someone with a very particular interest in our believing it." He knocked out his pipe and reached for the railway guide upon the shelf. "We shall see what Fairbourne Hall has to say for itself tomorrow. Be so good as to have your revolver in readiness, Watson, though I confess I think we shall have more need of your eyes than of your marksmanship before this business is done." Chapter 2. Suspects Under One Roof. The train that bore us down into Surrey the following morning ran through a country white with frost, the bare hedgerows glittering as though strung with 1,000 small jewels, and I remember thinking that so fair a landscape seemed a poor setting for the grim business that awaited us. Holmes said little upon the journey, being occupied for the greater part of an hour with a small notebook in which he had jotted from Sir Edmund's account the names and relations of those we were to meet. Only once did he speak of the matter itself. "You will observe, Watson," said he, folding away his notebook as the train began to slow, "that we go to this house with our minds already furnished by another man's opinions. Sir Edmund believes the trouble lies in shame rather than greed. Lestrade, I have no doubt, believes it lies in greed rather than shame. We shall do well to believe nothing at all until the house has spoken for itself." Fairbourne Hall proved to be a long, grey building of the Georgian period, set among elms that stood stripped and black against a leaden sky. There was an air of quiet prosperity about the place, yet also, as we came up the drive, a certain heaviness, as though the house itself held its breath. Sir Edmund met us at the door and conducted us at once to the drawing-room, where the household had gathered, I supposed, at his request. Clara Fairbourne rose to greet us with a composure that struck me immediately as remarkable in a woman so recently widowed. She was handsome still, though past her youth, with dark hair silvering at the temples, and a manner of speech so measured that each sentence seemed to have been weighed before it was permitted utterance. "You are very welcome, Mr. Holmes," said she, "though I confess I do not see what service a private detective can render where the police have already begun their inquiries." "Mrs. Fairbourne is concerned, I think," Sir Edmund put in hastily, "that further investigation may only prolong the family's distress." "I am concerned," she corrected him gently, "that it may prolong the family's exposure to gossip. There is a difference, Edmund, though I do not expect a man to feel it as a woman does." Holmes bowed slightly but made no answer to this, and I saw his grey eyes move, quick and unobtrusive, from her face to her hands, which lay folded in her lap with a stillness that seemed to me, upon reflection, almost deliberate. It was Arthur Vane who next claimed our attention, coming forward with an easy, confiding manner that I confess I found agreeable, though I noted that Holmes received his cordiality with a certain reserve. He was a well-made young man of perhaps 30, fashionably dressed, with a sort of open countenance that inspires trust before it has been earned. "A shocking business, Mr. Holmes," said he, shaking his head. "Poor Lionel, and now this wretched trouble with the signature on top of it. I confess I hardly know what to make of it." "You are often in the house, I understand," said Holmes. "I have lived here these 3 years, on Lionel's charity, as I'm sure someone has already told you." He laughed, though there was little mirth in it. "I make no secret of my debts, Mr. Holmes. A man who owes money to half the clubs in London learns to speak of it lightly, or not to speak of it at all. And you were near the study on the night in question." A flicker of something, I could not say whether it was alarm or merely surprise, crossed Vane's face. "I may have been. The corridor runs past the study to the billiard room, where I sat rather late that evening. I do not recall the precise hour." Holmes let the matter drop, though I observed that he made a small note in his book, and I thought I understood why. A man who does not recall so material a circumstance either has nothing to hide, or has been at pains to appear as though he had nothing to hide. We were then presented to Miss Beatrice Harland, the governess, a young woman of quiet, self-effacing manner, dressed with the plainness proper to her station. She answered our questions with evident reluctance, her eyes moving more than once toward Mrs. Fairbairn before she spoke, as though seeking some silent permission. "I know very little of the family's affairs, Mr. Holmes," said she. "My duties concern the children only. And yet you have lived in this house some years, I think." "5 years, sir." "Long enough to know its moods, if not its business," said Holmes, with a faint smile that seemed to put her somewhat at her ease, though I noticed she did not smile in return. "Last of all we met Henry Fairbairn, and I own that my sympathies went out to him at once, for there was in his bearing something of the uncertainty of a man who does not know whether he stands upon solid ground or upon sand. He was perhaps 22, dark like his father's family, with a directness of gaze that I found refreshing after the careful reticence of the others. "I will tell you plainly, Mr. Holmes," said he, "that I have more to lose by this business than any soul in the house. Without that signature I am nothing here, less than a servant, for a servant at least is paid for his labour. I do not know who erased it, but I swear to you I did not." "No one has accused you, Mr. Fairbairn," said Holmes mildly. "No," the young man returned, with a bitterness that surprised me, "but I have observed how they look at me when they believe I do not see it." When the household had dispersed and we were left alone with Sir Edmund and presently with Inspector Lestrade, who had been engaged upon his own inquiries in another part of the house, that gentleman came in rubbing his hands with the satisfaction of a man who believes his case well in hand. "I think we need look no further than Mr. Arthur Vane, Mr. Holmes," said he. "Debts up to his ears, no clear account of his movements, and a very obvious interest in seeing any legal complication thrown into confusion. Money, Mr. Holmes. It is nearly always money." "It is very often money, Lestrade," Holmes replied, "which is not quite the same thing. I confess I found Mr. Vane's forgetfulness regarding his own movements less interesting than Mrs. Fairbairn's very excellent memory for the exact wording of a document she claims not to have troubled herself with." Lestrade stared at him. "You think the widow concerned in it?" "I think, Lestrade, that in a house where every person has been at pains to appear composed, the one thing worth noticing is composure itself." Holmes turned to the window, through which the bare elms stood black against the fading light. "We shall want to see the study, Sir Edmund, before the dinner hour. I find that rooms, unlike people, are seldom capable of deliberate falsehood." Chapter 3. The Disturbance in the Study. The study of Fairbourne Hall lay at the end of a panelled corridor upon the ground floor, a room of moderate size lined with the sort of solemn legal volumes that seem, in such houses, to accumulate of their own accord across generations. Sir Edmund unlocked the door for us himself, explaining that it had been kept shut since his brother's death save for the brief examination made by the physician, and later by Lestrade. "Nothing has been moved, Mr. Holmes," said he, "beyond what was absolutely necessary in removing my brother's body." Holmes stood a moment upon the threshold, and I observed that he did not at once cross into the room, but remained there with his eyes travelling slowly from the window to the fireplace, from the fireplace to the desk, as a man might survey a chessboard before committing himself to a single move. Only when he had completed this silent survey did he step within, and then it was with the light, deliberate tread I had come to know so well, as though he feared to disturb some invisible arrangement of the air itself. "The window, I think, was found secured," said he. "Latched from within, and the shutters closed besides," Sir Edmund answered. "There is no possibility of entrance or exit by that means. I had the frame examined by a carpenter only yesterday, at the inspector's request." "And the door was locked, with the key discovered upon your brother's person?" "In his waistcoat pocket, where he habitually carried it." Holmes nodded and moved to the great desk that stood before the window, upon which lay still a disorder of papers such as a man might leave who expected to return to them upon the morrow. He bent low over these for some minutes, saying nothing, while Lestrade, who had joined us, shifted from one foot to the other with the air of a man restraining himself from some observation he considered eminently sensible. "You'll find nothing there that my own men have not already noted, Mr. Holmes," said he at last. "The document in question, here it is, under glass, as you asked it be kept, shows the erasure plainly enough, once you know where to look." Holmes took up the paper with a care that spoke of long practice in the handling of delicate evidence, and carried it to the window, where what light remained to the winter afternoon fell most strongly. He drew from his pocket the small lens he never travelled without, and I watched his face as he bent over the document, that face which, in moments of concentration, seemed to lose every trace of the languor it wore at other times, becoming instead as keen and still as a bird of prey. "The erasure is not scraped," said he presently, "nor is it bleached by any acid I am familiar with at first glance, though I shall wish to examine it further under stronger magnification. It has been lifted, Watson, drawn out of the fibre of the paper itself, as one might draw the colour from a stain, leaving the surface unbroken. It is exceedingly skilful work. I have seen perhaps 3 men in London capable of it, and none of them, I think, has occasion to visit Surrey." "Then it was done here, by someone in the house," said Lestrade with satisfaction. "It would appear so," Holmes agreed, though something in his tone suggested to me that satisfaction was not among the emotions the discovery had produced in him. He set the document down and turned his attention to the mantel, upon which stood a handsome clock of gilt bronze, flanked by 2 candlesticks. He studied this for some moments, with an attention that seemed, to my eye, disproportionate to so ordinary an object, and then knelt upon the hearthrug to examine the ashes in the grate, sifting them gently with a small ivory implement he carried for such purposes. "The fire was built up considerably higher than the season alone would warrant," said he. "You will observe, Lestrade, that these ashes are not the ashes of coal merely, but show the fine grey residue of paper burnt entirely away. Not a letter, not a single sheet, but a considerable quantity, burnt in haste and stirred afterward, I think, to break up the fragments." "Old letters, perhaps," Sir Edmund suggested. "My brother was not a sentimental man, but he kept a great many papers, and it would not surprise me if he chose that evening to be rid of some of them." "It may be so," said Holmes, though without conviction. He rose and crossed to the desk once more, drawing open the blotting book that lay upon it. "Here is a curiosity, however, that sentiment alone will not explain. This blotting paper is fresh, Sir Edmund, scarcely a week old by the look of it, and yet I am told your brother wrote no letters upon the evening of his death. The servants report no correspondence sent, none received. Why then should a new sheet have been fitted to this blotter so shortly before he died? No one answered him, and I confess the question struck me, upon reflection, as a singularly penetrating one, though I could not myself have said what it signified. "And the clock," Holmes continued, moving back to the mantel, "stands some 2 inches from the mark left in the dust of the shelf beneath it. You will see the outline plainly, where the housemaid's cloth has not reached in her weekly dusting. It has been moved, and moved recently, and not, I think, by any servant's hand, for every other object upon this shelf stands undisturbed in its accustomed place." Lestrade frowned at the little clock as though it had personally affronted him. "I don't see what a clock has to do with a man's death from natural causes, Mr. Holmes." "Very possibly nothing," Holmes admitted, "and very possibly a great deal. I have found, Lestrade, that a room tells its story most honestly in precisely those details which seem to have no bearing upon the matter at hand. A man does not move a clock, or feed a fresh sheet to his blotter, or build his fire unnaturally high without some purpose, however small, and where a household displays, as this one does, so remarkable a scarcity of grief alongside so remarkable an abundance of composure, I confess I grow curious as to what purposes may have been served in this room before ever Lionel Fairborn was found dead in his chair." He straightened, drawing his coat about him, for the room, despite the fire that had evidently blazed so fiercely 2 nights before, held now only the raw chill proper to an English country house in January. "I think we have learned what this room can tell us for the present," said he. "It remains to discover what the household will tell us of itself, and I confess, Sir Edmund, that I set rather greater store by the second inquiry than the first." Chapter 4. Reactions without tears. Dinner that evening was a subdued affair, taken at Sir Edmund's insistence in a small breakfast room rather than the great dining hall, as though the household could not yet bring itself to resume the ordinary ceremonies of the table. I sat between Holmes and our host, and had ample opportunity in the intervals of a conversation that never rose above the merely civil to observe the family whose troubles had brought us down into Surrey. It was afterward, when the ladies had withdrawn, and Sir Edmund had gone to confer with his solicitor by telegram, that Lestrade found us in the small library and drew a chair close to Holmes's with the air of a man bearing news he considered conclusive. "I think you'll agree, Mr. Holmes, that the case against Vane grows stronger by the hour," said he, producing his notebook. "One of the housemaids, Susan, her name is, tells me that Mr. Vane asked her, on the very afternoon of Mr. Fairborn's death, whether she knew where the spare key to the study was kept. She thought nothing of it at the time, she says, for he had asked such questions before regarding one room or another, being a careless sort of gentleman about his own belongings. But taken with what follows, I think it tells its own tale." "And what follows?" Holmes inquired, though I fancied from his tone that he had already guessed. "This." Lestrade produced from an envelope a small torn scrap of paper, much creased, upon which I could make out a few printed words and figures in the manner of a betting slip. "Found this very afternoon, wedged behind the skirting board in the corridor outside the study by one of my own men. It bears the name of a club in Jermyn Street of which Mr. Vane is a member, and a wager some £40 against him unpaid." Holmes took the scrap and examined it with interest, though not, I thought, with the satisfaction that Lestrade plainly expected of him. "A £40 debt is no trifling matter to a man of Mr. Vane's circumstances," he observed. "Yet I confess I am puzzled that so careful a criminal as the one who erased that signature should leave behind him so careless a trail. It is rather as though a burglar, having picked a lock with the delicacy of a surgeon, had then paused to write his name upon the wall." "Criminals are not always consistent, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, with the faint superiority of a man quoting a maxim he has found useful before. "A man may be clever in one thing and a fool in another." "He may indeed," Holmes agreed, "and I do not discount the possibility. I shall wish to speak with Mr. Vane again before I form any settled opinion." He rose and stretched himself before the fire. "But come, Lestrade, I think we have sat long enough over our theories. Let us see what the drawing-room has to show us this evening." We found the ladies there before us, Mrs. Fairbairn seated at some needlework she scarcely seemed to attend to, and Miss Harland near the window, with a book unopened upon her knee. It was Holmes's habit, in the course of an investigation, to speak sometimes of matters wholly unconnected with his purpose, watching all the while for those small involuntary responses that a guarded tongue cannot always govern, and I saw him employ this method now, remarking idly upon the portraits that lined the walls, the history of the house, the weather that had kept us company upon our journey down. It was only when he turned, as though by chance, to the subject of the household's future arrangements, and mentioned young Henry Fairbairn's name in connection with the disputed inheritance, that I observed a change come over Clara Fairbairn so swift and so complete that I could not doubt its significance. The needle stopped in her hand. Her colour, which had been high enough before, seemed to drain from her face in an instant, leaving her for the space of perhaps 2 seconds as pale and as still as the marble bust that stood upon the mantel behind her. "I am sure I do not know what is to become of any of us," said she, recovering herself with an effort I could only admire, "until the lawyers have settled what my late husband so carelessly left unsettled." It was said lightly enough, and I dare say a less practised observer than Holmes might have thought nothing of it, but I had seen his eyes upon her face in the instant of that pallor, and I knew from long experience of his methods that the observation had not been lost upon him. He turned then to Miss Harland and asked her, in the same idle manner, whether the household had kept to its usual hours upon the evening of Mr. Fairbairn's death. "I believe so, Mr. Holmes," said she, though I fancied a certain carefulness had crept into her voice. "Dinner at the accustomed hour, then? 7:30, I think Sir Edmund told me." Yes, I believe so." She bent her head over her book, though I noted she did not turn its pages. "You are not perfectly certain?" "It is not a matter I had occasion to remark particularly, Mr. Holmes. The children's hours differ from the families, and I confess I do not always attend closely to the arrangements below stairs." Holmes let the matter rest there, though I saw him make no note of it, which was, I had learned, sometimes a surer sign of his interest than the reverse, for he trusted little to paper what he had once fixed securely in that remarkable memory of his. When we had at last retired to the room Sir Edmund had prepared for us, and I had settled myself before the fire with the comfortable expectation of hearing Holmes's conclusions, he surprised me instead by falling into a silence broken only once, as he stood at the window looking out upon the frosted lawn. "You will have observed, Watson, the curious arithmetic of grief in this house," said he at last. "I own I found the household remarkably composed," I answered, "for a family so lately bereaved." "Composed is not the word I should choose. Concealed, Watson, concealed and calculating, each after his own fashion. Arthur Vane calculates his own safety. Miss Harland calculates her loyalty, though to whom I am not yet certain. And Mrs. Fairbairn—" He paused, and I saw the ghost of a frown pass across his brow. "Mrs. Fairbairn calculates something a great deal more particular than either, unless I am very much mistaken. I have noticed, in the course of tonight's conversation, that this is not a house in which truth is hidden, because it is valuable. It is hidden, I think, because it is shameful. And shame, Watson, is a far more patient guardian of secrets than mere greed will ever be." He said no more that night, but I lay long awake, turning over in my mind the image of Clara Fairbairn's face in the instant her composure had failed her, and wondering what manner of shame could lie concealed beneath so proud and careful an exterior. Chapter 5. The Governess's Half-Truth. Morning brought with it a hard, bright frost, and Holmes, who had risen before me, was already at breakfast when I came down, though he had eaten little, being occupied instead in turning over the pages of a small book he had borrowed, I later learned, from the household's library the evening before, a treatise upon the chemistry of inks and their preservation, a subject upon which, as in so many others, he had contrived to make himself something of an authority. "I have asked Sir Edmund to arrange that I might speak with Miss Harland alone this morning," said he, closing the book as I seated myself. There is a reticence about that young woman, Watson, that I have observed before in persons who guard, not their own secrets, but another's. Such witnesses are generally the most valuable and the most difficult that a case affords. We found Miss Harland in the small schoolroom at the rear of the house, where she had evidently been occupied with the children's lessons before Sir Edmund's summons reached her, for a slate stood upon an easel still bearing the marks of an unfinished sum. She rose as we entered, her hands folding themselves before her in the attitude of a woman schooled to composure by long practice, though I thought her eyes betrayed something the rest of her bearing sought to conceal. "You need not be alarmed, Miss Harland," said Holmes, taking the chair she offered him with a gentleness of manner I had seen him assume before with witnesses whose trust was worth more than their fear. "I have not come to accuse you of anything, but only to ask what you may know of the ordinary life of this house, which I think you understand better than any person I have yet spoken with." "I am a governess, Mr. Holmes," said she. "I am not generally consulted upon the family's affairs." "And yet you have lived among them 5 years, and a woman of observation as I think you are, cannot help but learn a household's true temper, whatever is or is not confided to her directly." He paused. "I understand that Mr. Fairbairn intended upon the evening of his death to make some announcement to the family after dinner. Is that correct?" She hesitated, and I saw her glance toward the door as though she feared it might open upon some listener. "I had heard as much," said she at last, low. "Susan mentioned it to me, the housemaid, I mean, who had it from Mr. Fairbairn's own valet. It was to be some matter of importance, though I was not told what. You formed some conjecture of your own, I think." Again she hesitated, and I saw her hands tighten upon each other. "I still believe, Mr. Holmes, that it concerned Mr. Henry. His position in the family has always been uncertain in a manner that I do not think it my place to explain, and I suppose that Mr. Fairbairn intended at last to settle it, publicly and finally, by acknowledging the magistrate's confirmation of his claim before the whole household." "And was this announcement made?" "It was not, sir. It was to have followed dinner, but dinner itself was delayed by some half-hour, and by the time the family rose from the table, Mr. Fairbairn had already retired to his study, saying he wished to be private a while first. He was found the next morning, as you know." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "You say dinner was delayed? By whose order?" "I could not say with certainty, Mr. Holmes. I was told only that the hour had been changed, and I confess I thought little of it at the time, servants' arrangements being altered for one reason or another most days of the week. And yet you told me yesterday evening, when I asked you the same question in Mrs. Fairbairn's presence, that dinner had been kept to its accustomed hour." The colour rose sharply in her face, and for a moment I thought she would deny it. But there was something in Holmes's quiet, unhurried gaze that seemed to draw the truth from her more surely than any sternness could have done. "I did not wish to speak of it before Mrs. Fairbairn," said she at last, very low. "It was she who gave the order for the delay, Mr. Holmes, though I do not know why, nor do I think it my place to guess at her reasons." "You need not guess, Miss Harland. You need only tell me what you observed." "A note was brought to her, not an hour before dinner was to be served, brought by hand, though I do not know by whom, for it was not carried in upon the usual salver, but given to her privately in the hall. She read it, and I saw her face change, and within the quarter-hour word had gone down to the kitchen that dinner should be put back half an hour. I thought it strange, but I said nothing, for it is not my custom to remark upon what does not concern me." "And after dinner, did you observe Mrs. Fairbairn's movements?" "I saw her go toward the study myself, Mr. Holmes, though I thought nothing of it at the time, for she often went to speak with her husband upon household matters before he settled to his papers for the evening. I did not see her return, for I went up to the nursery shortly after, the younger children requiring my attention." Holmes was silent a moment, his eyes fixed upon the unfinished sum that still stood chalked upon the slate, though I do not think he saw it at all. "You're fond of Mr. Henry, I think," said he at last, in a tone that seemed almost gentle. "I am fond of him as I should be fond of any pupil I had watched grow to manhood in this house, Mr. Holmes," said she, with a dignity that I found suddenly affecting. He has been treated less kindly here than his nature deserves, and I will own that it grieves me to see him made to feel a stranger under his own father's roof. And you are afraid of Mrs. Fairbairn? It was not a question, and I saw that Miss Harland understood it as none, for she made no denial, only lowering her eyes to her folded hands. I have my position to consider, Mr. Holmes, said she simply, and I have learned, in 5 years, that Mrs. Fairbairn does not forgive readily those who cross her, however small the offence. When we had left her, and were walking back along the frost-hardened path toward the house, Holmes said little, though I could see that his mind moved swiftly upon what he had heard. A note delivered by hand, Watson, an altered dinner hour, and a widow who visits her husband's study within the hour of his death, yet claims before company to despise all matters of business, said he at length. I think we begin to see the shape of this affair, though I confess we have not yet seen its face. We shall want to know who carried that note and what it contained before we go much further. Chapter 6. Alliances and Silence. Holmes spent the better part of that afternoon below stairs, a region of the house into which I did not follow him, having been persuaded instead by Sir Edmund to walk with him about the grounds, where our host seemed to find some relief in speaking of matters wholly unconnected with the tragedy that had befallen his family. When I rejoined Holmes toward evening, I found him in the small room set aside for our use, seated before the fire with an expression I had learned to associate with the successful conclusion of some difficult inquiry. "You have been busy," said I. "I have been listening, Watson, which is a different matter, and generally the more profitable of the two." He drew his chair a little nearer mine. "I have spoken with the housekeeper, with the cook, with 2 housemaids, and with the old butler Meekins, who has served this family longer than any other soul beneath its roof, and I have discovered among them all a most curious unanimity." Unanimity as to what? As to what must not be discussed. He rose and paced twice across the small room before continuing. "You will have noticed, Watson, that a household of servants is generally the freest with its gossip of any body of persons in England. They will discuss a master's debts, a mistress's temper, a young lady's suitors, with a candour that would astonish the family concerned, could they but overhear it. Yet upon one subject, and one only, I found this household as silent as the grave, and silent, moreover, in a manner too uniform to be accidental. And that subject? Lionel Fairbairn's first marriage. I confess the word startled me, for nothing in what we had been told had prepared me for so unexpected a disclosure. His first marriage? I had understood Mrs. Fairbairn to be his only wife. So, I think, the household has been at pains these many years to have it understood, both by the neighbourhood and, so far as might be managed, by the family itself. But old Meekins, who has been 40 years in service and has outlived, I think, whatever loyalty he once felt to keeping other men's secrets, let fall enough, under careful questioning, to satisfy me that Lionel Fairbairn was married once before in his youth to a woman of no great fortune or family, and that Henry is the son of that marriage. But then Henry's legitimacy should never have been in question at all. There, Watson, lies the whole matter, and I confess it took me the better part of an hour's patient questioning to draw the particulars from a man who plainly regarded the subject as one he had promised himself, long ago, never again to discuss. The marriage, it seems, was contracted abroad, in Italy, I believe, and was never properly registered according to English law, owing to some irregularity in the ceremony that need not concern us at present. The lady died some years later, believing herself and being believed by her husband to be his lawful wife. It was only after Lionel's second marriage to Clara that the irregularity came to light, through some inquiry made, I gather, by Clara's own family before the match was concluded, they being naturally anxious that no impediment should exist. And Henry? Henry was already some years old by the time this discovery was made, and had been raised until then in the full belief that he was his father's lawful heir. The scandal, had it become generally known, must have ruined not only the boy's prospects, but his mother's memory, for a marriage found irregular in the eyes of the law is very easily represented by unkind tongues as no marriage at all. The family chose silence, Watson, the silence of shame, as I said to you before, rather than the silence of guilt, and the matter was allowed to rest, Henry being given a home and an education, but never, until his father's recent decision, any legal acknowledgement of his true position. And the magistrate's signature was to have supplied, at last, what the irregular Italian ceremony could not, a formal legal recognition, obtained I know not by what particular process, that would have restored to Henry, in the eyes of English law and English society both, the legitimacy his father's first marriage had failed, through no fault of the lady's own, to secure him. You'll see now, Watson, why its erasure strikes so much deeper than any question of mere inheritance. It would not simply have altered who inherits Fairbourne Hall. It would have compelled this entire household, and this entire county, to confess publicly and irrevocably a truth it has spent more than 20 years concealing. I sat for some minutes in silence, turning this intelligence over in my mind, and I confess that my sympathies, which had already inclined toward young Henry, were now more firmly fixed upon him than ever. Then Arthur Vane's debts seem a very small matter beside such a motive as this, said I at last. They do, Watson, and I think it worth remarking that Vane, whatever his faults, has never struck me as a man of any particular subtlety. A gambler in debt might snatch at a purse or forge a cheque or even, in some desperate hour, resort to violence. But the erasure of that signature was not the work of desperation. It was the work of patience and of very considerable skill, exercised, I think, by someone who understood not merely that the signature must vanish, but precisely how it must vanish, so that its disappearance might pass at first glance for a thing that had never existed at all. You believe, then, that Vane is innocent? I believe that Vane is guilty of a great many small follies, and innocent, I strongly suspect, of this one large crime, though I do not yet say so with certainty, Watson, for I have been wrong before, and I do not care to repeat the experience oftener than I must. He stood again at the window, looking out into the dusk that had begun to gather over the frosted lawn. I think, however, that we have found at last the true shape of the motive that has eluded us these 3 days. It is not greed that has moved the hand behind this crime, Watson. It is pride, and the terror of a shame 20 years buried, suddenly threatened with the light. Chapter 7. The Convenient Trail of Debt. It was upon the 4th morning of our stay at Fairbourne Hall that Lestrade came to us in a state of suppressed triumph, such as I had seen upon him before. At the close of investigations, he believed himself to have brought single-handedly to a successful conclusion. He found us at breakfast and seated himself without ceremony, his notebook already open upon the table. "I think this will interest you, Mr. Holmes," said he. "My men searched Mr. Vane's room thoroughly yesterday evening, at my direction, and found, concealed at the back of a wardrobe drawer, this." He produced a small bottle of dark glass, stoppered, containing perhaps 2 ounces of some colourless liquid, and set it upon the table between us with the air of a conjurer producing his final trick. "A chemical solvent," said he, "of the kind used, I am informed, for the removal of ink from parchment and similar materials. I had it examined by a chemist in Guildford yesterday afternoon, and he assures me it is entirely capable of producing an effect such as we observed upon the magistrate's document." Holmes took up the bottle and turned it slowly in his long fingers, holding it to the light of the window. "And Mr. Vane's explanation?" "He claims he purchased it some months ago to clean an old print he had acquired. A family portrait, he says, that had grown discoloured with age and grime. A likely story, Mr. Holmes, and one he produced with a great deal more haste than conviction, if you ask my opinion of it." "I confess his explanation does sound weak," said Holmes, setting the bottle down, "though I have known weak explanations to be true ones before now, Lestrade, quite as often as I have known plausible explanations to be false. Where is the print in question? He says it hangs in his own room, and indeed there is a print there of some rustic subject or other, though whether it has ever been cleaned with anything at all I could not say from mere looking at it. I confess that upon hearing this fresh discovery, my own suspicions, which Holmes's account of the household silence had somewhat diverted from Arthur Vane, returned to him with renewed force, and I said as much to Holmes when Lestrade had gone below to consult further with his men. "It is a very natural conclusion, Watson," said he, "and I do not wonder that you draw it. Indeed, I think the household draws it also, and draws it, I fancy, with no small relief. You will have observed, since Lestrade's discovery became generally known this morning, a certain lightening of the atmosphere at table, a readiness to speak again of ordinary things, a colour returned to cheeks that were pale enough 3 days ago. It is a curious thing, Watson, how gladly a household will seize upon the guilt of its least respectable member, if only it may be spared the necessity of examining its more respectable ones. You do not believe, then, that Vane is guilty? I believe that false explanations succeed very often for precisely the reason that they permit everyone concerned to stop thinking, and I have found that a household's collective relief is one of the least reliable guides to truth that I have ever encountered." He rose. "But I do not ask you to take my word for it upon faith alone, Watson. Let us test the matter, as it ought to be tested." He procured, with Sir Edmund's ready permission, a small quantity of paper of the same manufacture as the magistrate's document, Sir Edmund's solicitor having fortunately retained several sheets of the identical stock for the drawing of similar instruments, and set himself that afternoon in a small room given over to his use, to experiment with the solvent Lestrade had discovered, applying it in careful measure to ink of the same character as that which the erased signature must have borne. I watched him at this work for the better part of 2 hours, saying little, for I had learned long since that his concentration at such moments was not to be lightly disturbed. At length he held up the treated paper to the window, and I saw upon his face an expression that told me, before he spoke, that his experiment had confirmed some conclusion he had already privately reached. "You will observe, Watson," said he, "that the solvent Lestrade discovered does indeed remove ink from paper, as the Guildford chemist assured him. But observe also how it removes it." He passed the sheet to me, and I saw that where the ink had been treated, the paper's surface had been left roughened and faintly discoloured, the fibres themselves disturbed by the chemical's action, so that even to the naked eye a trace of violence remained upon the sheet. "It looks nothing like the erasure upon the magistrate's document," I said, recalling the smooth, unbroken surface Holmes had shown me 3 days before. "Nothing whatever, Watson. The solvent in that bottle is a crude instrument, effective enough for the cleaning of an old print, as Mr. Vane claims, but wholly incapable of the delicate invisible work performed upon that signature. Whoever erased the magistrate's name from that document employed a method very different from this one, a method, I believe, involving heat and a particular preparation of bleaching agents, applied with extraordinary patience, such as I have encountered in the restoration of old manuscripts, and such as very few persons in England, let alone in this household, could be expected to command. Then the bottle proves nothing against Vane at all. It proves only that Mr. Vane possesses a chemical solvent and a plausible use for it, neither of which constitutes evidence of the crime with which the household is so eager to charge him." Holmes set down the treated sheet and regarded it thoughtfully. "I begin to suspect, Watson, that the bottle was never meant to prove guilt so much as to provide comfort, a convenient explanation, requiring no further examination of consciences that would very much prefer to remain unexamined. Whether it was placed in that drawer by design, or whether Mr. Vane's own carelessness has merely furnished the household with an opportunity it was only too glad to seize, I do not yet know. But I am now very much more interested, Watson, in discovering who among this family possesses the particular knowledge such an erasure demands, than in pursuing any further the unhappy Mr. Vane, whose chief crime, I begin to believe, is nothing worse than an unfortunate talent for appearing guilty of everything and responsible for nothing. Chapter 8. The Contradiction of Clara Fairborn. Holmes said nothing to Lestrade of his experiment with the solvent, a reticence that surprised me somewhat until he explained, as we walked together in the frosted garden that evening, that he preferred an adversary, if adversary there were within that house, to believe herself secure a while longer. "A suspect who feels the net drawing close will grow careful, Watson," said he. "But a suspect who believes herself already safe will grow very often careless in her safety. I have found the second condition a great deal more productive than the first." It was with this end in view, I think, that he contrived, over the 2 days that followed, to spend a considerable portion of his time in Clara Fairborn's company, drawing her into conversations that ranged, apparently at random, over her husband's character, her own history, and the management of the estate, while appearing himself to have set aside, for the present, any suspicion that might attach to her. I own that I found this deception, however necessary to his purpose, a little uncomfortable to witness, for Mrs. Fairborn, believing herself no longer an object of scrutiny, spoke with a freedom she had not shown before, and I could not always tell whether what I heard from her was artifice or simple truth. It was on the second of these 2 days that Holmes remarked to me, as we sat alone after dinner, upon certain inconsistencies he had observed in her conversation which he had not troubled to point out at the time they occurred. "You will have heard her speak, Watson, of her devotion to her husband's memory," said he, "and I confess she speaks of it beautifully, with a choice of language that does credit to her education. Yet I have watched her these 2 days handle his belongings, his pipe, his spectacles, the small ornaments that stood upon his desk, and I have observed in her manner toward them nothing whatever of tenderness. She moves them as a housekeeper moves the furniture of a room she means shortly to have done with, not as a widow handles the relics of a man she loved." "It may be that grief takes some persons in that manner," I suggested. "Not all natures are alike in their mourning." "That is very true, Watson, and I should not build a case upon so slight a foundation alone. But consider further. She has told me upon 2 separate occasions that she despises all matters of business and law, finding them tedious beyond bearing, fit only for men's minds to trouble themselves with. And yet, not an hour ago, in speaking of the estate's affairs, she named to me, without the least hesitation, the precise clause of her husband's will governing the disposition of the Surrey property, down to the very page upon which it is recorded, a degree of particularity I should scarcely expect from a woman who claims never to trouble herself with such documents at all. A slip of memory, perhaps, from long association with the subject. Perhaps, Watson, but there was more. When I asked her quite directly what she supposed would become of young Henry, once the estate's affairs were finally settled, she answered, and I set down her words as nearly as I can recall them, that he would be happier in the end without a name that brings such burden with it. Holmes paused, and I saw that he had fixed his eyes upon the fire with an intensity that told me he attached great weight to the observation. "It is a strange thing to say of a young man's own name, Watson, unless one has already privately concluded that the name in question is not, in truth, rightfully his to bear." I had no answer ready to this, and we sat some while in silence, until our conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the hall below. Voices raised, a door thrown open, and presently the sound of hurried footsteps upon the stair. Holmes was on his feet in an instant, and we descended together to find Lestrade and one of his constables, restraining none too gently the person of Arthur Vane, who had been discovered, it transpired, attempting to leave the house by a side door with a travelling bag in his hand, at an hour when no train ran from the nearest station until morning. "Running were you, Mr. Vane?" Lestrade demanded, with the grim satisfaction of a man who believes his case complete at last. "That has a very guilty look to it, sir, and I shall want a proper explanation before this night is out." Vane's face, ordinarily so ready with its easy, confiding smile, had gone the colour of ash, and I saw his hands tremble as he set down the bag Lestrade had wrested from him. "I have done nothing, Lestrade, I swear it," said he, "but I saw well enough which way the wind was blowing in this house, with that bottle found in my room, and every eye turned upon me at table as though I were already condemned. I thought only to remove myself before matters grew worse, and to write from London explaining myself fully, once I had collected my thoughts. "That is a very poor account of an innocent man's conduct," said Lestrade. It was Holmes who interposed, laying a hand upon the inspector's arm. "A moment, Lestrade, if you please." He turned to Vane, and his voice, though quiet, carried an authority that seemed to steady the young man where Lestrade's sternness had only shaken him further. "You have not been entirely open with us, Mr. Vane, though I do not think your concealment touches the matter of the signature at all. Tell me plainly, is it your debts alone that drove you toward that door tonight? Or is there some further matter you have kept from your family's knowledge?" Vane's composure, such as remained of it, broke altogether at this, and he sank into a chair with his face in his hands. "My debts are a great deal worse than I have owned to anyone in this house, Mr. Holmes," said he low. "Worse than Lionel himself ever knew, God rest him. I have borrowed against expectations I had no right to borrow against. And when I heard that bottle spoken of as though it settled the whole affair, I confess I lost my nerve entirely. I thought only of escaping before the truth of my folly came out along with the rest, not of any signature, which I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, upon whatever you please, I never touched." Holmes regarded him for a long moment with that penetrating, unhurried gaze I had seen him turn upon witnesses before, weighing, I did not doubt, the whole of the young man's bearing against the words he had spoken. "I believe you, Mr. Vane," said he at last, "though I fancy Inspector Lestrade will wish some fuller accounting of your finances before the night is done. You're guilty, I think, of weakness and of folly, and very possibly of debts that will trouble you a good while yet. But I do not believe you are guilty of the one matter that has brought Dr. Watson and myself into this house, and I begin to believe, moreover, that I know now where that guilt truly lies." Chapter 9. Holmes names the true motive. It was upon the following evening that Holmes requested Sir Edmund to gather the household in the drawing-room, saying only that he believed himself now in a position to lay the whole matter before them. I'd seen him make such requests before, in the course of other investigations, and I confess that even long familiarity with his methods had not entirely dulled in me the peculiar tension of such an hour, when a room full of anxious faces waits upon the pleasure of a single quiet man standing before the fire. They assembled by degrees, Sir Edmund first, grave and watchful, then Arthur Vane, pale still from the events of the previous night, seating himself apart from the others as though he felt his recent disgrace set him at some distance from the family's confidence. Miss Harland, who took a chair near the door as if she wished to be able to withdraw from the scene at the first opportunity. Young Henry, whose dark eyes moved from face to face with an anxiety he did not trouble to conceal, and last of all Clara Fairborn, who entered with the same composed and upright bearing she had worn since our first meeting, and seated herself in the chair nearest the fire, as though by right of long possession. Lestrade stood near the window, his notebook ready, and I saw upon his features an expression of professional curiosity not unmixed, I fancied, with a certain apprehension, for he had staked a good deal of confidence upon Arthur Vane's guilt, and I do not think he relished the prospect of seeing that confidence overturned before witnesses. Holmes began quietly, without preamble. "I have been asked to discover who erased the magistrate's signature from the document that would have confirmed Mr. Henry Fairborn's legitimate claim upon this estate. I believe I can now answer that question, but I ask your patience while I set before you first the reasons that lead me to it, for I think the truth of this matter will bear no other telling." He turned first to Arthur Vane. "Mr. Vane has been suspected, and not without some appearance of reason. He had debts, he had opportunity, and a chemical solvent capable of removing ink was discovered among his belongings. Yet I have tested that solvent, and I tell you plainly that it could not have produced the erasure we observed upon that document. Its action is crude and leaves the paper roughened and discoloured. The erasure of the magistrate's signature was performed by a very different method, one requiring heat and patience and a knowledge of the chemistry of old ink that few persons in England, let alone in this house, could be expected to possess. Mr. Vane, I am satisfied, is guilty of debt and of folly, but not of this." Vane, who had sat throughout this recital with his eyes fixed upon the carpet, looked up with something like gratitude, though he said nothing. Miss Harland, Holmes continued, turning toward her with a gentleness I had noted before in his manner toward her, possessed knowledge of the household's arrangements upon the evening in question, and knowledge, too, of the family history that gives this matter its true weight. But she had no access to the study that night, being occupied with the children in the nursery, and no discernible motive, moreover, to wish Mr. Henry's claim defeated, whose interest she has, I think, always held rather closer to her heart than her position strictly required. And Henry himself, Holmes went on before the young man could speak, had everything in the world to lose and nothing whatever to gain by the signature's destruction. A man does not generally destroy the one document that secures his own future. He paused, and I saw his eyes come to rest at last upon Clara Fairborn, who met his gaze without flinching, her hands folded still and composed upon her lap. There remained, then, one person in this household who possessed both the opportunity and, I came at last to believe, the motive, someone who feared, not the loss of money, but the loss of something a great deal more precious to a certain temperament, position and the fiction of an unblemished name. "You're speaking of me, Mr. Holmes," said Clara Fairborn, and her voice, though quiet, carried an edge I had not heard in it before. "I am, madam." Holmes did not raise his voice, but something in its even quietness seemed to fill the room more completely than any louder tone could have done. "You learned, I believe, some days before your husband's death, that he intended at last to acknowledge Henry's true legitimacy before the whole family, to restore to him, publicly and finally, the name and position that a legal irregularity, committed in innocence by his mother, had long denied him. This intention threatened you with a prospect you had spent 20 years guarding against, the public acknowledgment that the woman you had always regarded, and encouraged others to regard as beneath the family's consideration, must now be received among you as a rightful daughter of the house in all but living presence, her son restored to a place you had long assured yourself he could never rightfully claim. This is conjecture, Mr. Holmes," said she, though I thought her voice had grown less steady. "It is conjecture supported by evidence, madam, which I will now set before you. A note was delivered to you by hand upon the afternoon of your husband's death, after which you ordered dinner delayed by half an hour. Time enough, I believe, to compose yourself, and perhaps to make certain preparations before the evening's business was concluded. You were seen, by Miss Harland, going toward the study after dinner, though you have claimed since that you took no particular interest in your husband's papers that night. The fire in that room was built unnaturally high enough, I think, to warm the delicate solution required for so patient and precise an erasure, a process that cannot be hurried, and which demands, moreover, a steady and considerable heat. The clock upon the mantel had been moved, I believe to allow room upon the shelf for instruments not ordinarily kept there. And the blotting paper had been freshly changed, though no letter was written that evening. Changed, I believe, because the old sheet bore some trace of the work you had undertaken, and could not safely be left for a servant's eye to discover. The room had grown very still, and I saw Henry's face turned toward his stepmother. Pale with a dawning comprehension he seemed scarcely able to credit. "Your husband, I believe, returned to his study that night and discovered what you had done, perhaps by some chance disturbance of the very evidence you had sought to conceal. The shock of that discovery, the betrayal of a trust he had placed in you, and the ruin of an intention he had cherished, I think, as an act of long overdue justice, hastened the collapse that ended his life. He locked the door, madam, not against some intruder from without, but against the world itself, in the last private grief of a man who found his own household had deceived him. There was no murderer in that sealed room, Mrs. Fairborn. There was only a broken heart, and the secret you had left behind you." Clara Fairborn said nothing for a long moment, and I saw her hands, folded so carefully in her lap throughout the whole of Holmes's recital, tighten at last until the knuckles showed white against her dark gown. Chapter 10. A New Order at Fairborn Hall. For a long moment after Holmes had finished speaking, no one in that room stirred, and I remember thinking that the silence itself seemed to press upon us with a weight greater than any words could have carried. It was Clara Fairbairn who broke it at last, though not, as I had half expected, with denial. "You have built a very ingenious case, Mr. Holmes, from a moved clock and a fresh sheet of blotting paper," said she, and there was still, even now, a certain pride in her bearing that I could not help but admire, however little I approved the use to which it had so long been put. "I do not know that a court of law would find your evidence sufficient." "It might not, madam," Holmes admitted. "Circumstance and inference, however persuasive, are not always proof, and I have no wish to see this matter dragged through a court, where the very shame you sought to conceal would be laid open to the whole of England in the newspapers. But I did not come to this house merely to accuse. I came also prepared to settle, beyond any further dispute, the truth of Mr. Henry's claim, whatever became of the question of who erased the signature that once confirmed it." He drew from within his coat a folded paper, which he had procured, I later learned, from the magistrate's own office in the county town 2 days before, while I had supposed him occupied with his chemical experiments. "This is a certified copy from the magistrate's register, madam, recording the original confirmation of Mr. Henry Fairbairn's legitimacy, entered upon the public record at the time the document itself was signed. No erasure performed upon a private paper, however skilfully accomplished, can undo an entry made in a court's own books. The signature may be restored, madam, whenever the family chooses to apply for it. Restored, moreover, with a completeness that your labour of that terrible night was never in truth capable of preventing." I saw something go out of Clara Fairbairn then, some last reserve of defiance that had sustained her through Holmes's whole recital, and she sat back in her chair with the air of a woman who understands, at last, that the battle she had fought so long and so secretly had been lost before it was ever properly begun. "I did not mean for Lionel to die," said she, low, and I heard in her voice, for the first time since our arrival, something other than pride. "I meant only to prevent an announcement I believed would ruin us all, would set that woman's son above the family name in a manner I could not bear to see, after all the years I had given to protecting it. I did not know he had discovered what I had done until I heard him cry out, and by the time I reached the door he had already locked it against me. I stood in that corridor the whole night, Mr. Holmes, and heard nothing more, and told myself in the morning that whatever had happened to him, it could not be laid at my door. I have told myself so every day since, and I have very nearly believed it." No one spoke for some moments after this confession, and I saw Sir Edmund's face turn toward his brother's widow, working with an emotion too complicated, I think, for any single name, grief and anger, and something very near pity, all contending together. It was Henry who broke the silence at last, rising from his chair and crossing the room to where Clara sat. "I did not ask for what your husband meant to give me," said he, and his voice, though unsteady, carried a dignity that did him great credit. "I would have been content, I think, to go on as I was, had I known what the truth would cost this family. I am sorry for it, madam, more than I can say." I don't know that Clara Fairbairn found any comfort in these words, for her pride, I think, could accept forgiveness even less readily than it had accepted accusation. But she inclined her head and said nothing further, and Sir Edmund, after a low word with Lestrade, led her from the room, the inspector following at a discreet distance behind them. We remained at Fairbairn Hall 2 days longer, while the family solicitors set in motion the proceedings that would restore Henry's position beyond any further question, and while Sir Edmund, with a delicacy I thought did him credit, arranged matters so that Clara Fairbairn's disgrace, though known within the family, need never become the property of the county at large. Arthur Vane, I was glad to learn, found in his cousin's ruin a curious sobering of his own conduct, and Sir Edmund undertook, upon certain conditions regarding his future economy, to settle the worst of his debts, that the young man might have a fair opportunity to mend his fortunes honestly. On the morning of our departure, as we waited upon the platform of the small country station for the London train, I ventured to ask Holmes what he made, upon reflection, of the whole affair. "I think, Watson," said he, drawing his coat about him against the cold, "that we are too ready, in our investigations, to look first toward money as the spring of human wickedness, because money is a motive we may weigh and count and understand without difficulty. Pride is a subtler thing, and a more dangerous one, for it does not always know itself for what it is." Mrs. Fairbairn would have been horrified, I think, to hear her actions called by their true name upon the night she undertook them. She called it, I do not doubt, the protection of her family's honour, and believed it so most sincerely, even as she destroyed the very thing that might have preserved it. "It is a melancholy case," said I, "for all that justice has been done." "Most cases are melancholy, Watson, when one comes to examine what lies beneath them," Holmes replied. "Crime is very rarely the work of a moment's temptation merely. It is more often the last act of a much longer drama, played out over years, in silences and small deceptions that no single person ever quite intended to end where they did." He turned as the train came into view, its smoke rising black against the pale morning sky. "Greed, Watson, we understand and condemn readily enough, for it wears no disguise. But pride can dress itself as duty and honour and even love, and it is for that reason, I think, the more dangerous of the two, and the harder by far for a man to see clearly in himself before it is too late." We said no more upon the matter as the train bore us back toward London, and I have set down this account, as I have set down others before it, not because the mystery itself was the most intricate my friend ever unravelled, but because I have never forgotten the stillness of that drawing-room, nor the particular quality of Clara Fairbairn's silence, when at last the truth she had guarded so long was spoken aloud before her.